Benjamin P. Smith, one of the foremost experts on the modern history of Mexico. Benjamin has written books and articles on Mexican politics, violence, religion, journalism, and drug trafficking. He has also written recently on the boom in the fentanyl and opium trades in Mexico. He's a professor of Latin American history at the University of Warwick in Coventry, England. Today, he'll discuss his new book, The Dope, the Real History of the Mexican Drug Trade. And Benjamin has a presentation prepared. After that, I'll ask him some questions, and then we'll open it up to viewer questions. And if you have some questions, please use the Q&A feature. So Benjamin, thanks for being with us. And please go ahead and begin your presentation on the Mexican drug trade.
Right, thank you very much. I'm just going to put a slideshow up now. Don't fear, this is a relatively quick presentation, so it shouldn't take too long, and then we can get on to the perhaps more interesting piece of asking and answering questions. Is that good?
Yeah, there we go.
Perfect. Okay, well, thanks a lot for inviting me here to the Mob Museum to speak about my new book, The Dope. So the book's based on about a decade of my research, going through thousands of classified and declassified documents, talking to dozens of drug agents and drug traffickers, from the beaches of Santa Barbara to the Sierras of Oaxaca. Now, although the book itself is based on a load of research, I don't really envisage the book as a kind of academic history. And I've deliberately avoided the kind of academic ease that clogs so many of these books. And I think, in my opinion at least, seems to obscure rather than explain what's going on south of the border. So the book itself, you get stories about the cross-dressing border smuggler Enrique Fernandez, who pioneered the Ciudad Juarez trade. You get stories about the mysterious Ruperto Beltran, aka Papa Grande, who became the kind of hippies go-to Sin Semilla vendor. And you get stories about Arturo el Negro Durazo, who was the Mexico City police chief who built a mock Greek palace dubbed the Parthenon with the proceeds from the cocaine trade. So I hope I've made it pretty entertaining. But for this talk, I've been asked to give a brief overview of the Mexican drug trade from its roots among the peasants and the farmers of the Golden Triangle to the cartels and kingpins of today. But this is not simply a story of commercial change. It's also the story of how the Mexican drug trade went from fairly pacific and peaceful to so violent. Now, the Mexican drug trade then started, as one might expect, as soon as the United States prohibited the sale of narcotics. And from the 1914 Harrison Act onwards, border smugglers like Fernandez moved morphine and heroin and cocaine over the border to a thriving market. Yet up until the late 1930s, these narcotics were almost all created actually in the pharmaceutical factories of Europe, and then imported to Mexico by boat, and then shipped by train to the border, and then smuggled over. But in the late 1930s, global events interrupted this business. World War II cut the US off from traditional European and Asian suppliers of opiates. Some addicts went cold turkey, taking advantage of the dearth, but others turned to a new supplier, Mexico. Now, initially, this was only a trickle, but by 1943, US Customs claimed that Mexico was now, and I quote, the principal source of the supply of prepared opium to the United States. By the following year, it was the main supplier of both morphine and heroin. The source of these drugs then was basically a place called the Sierra Madre Occidental. This was, and you can see from the map, a mountain range that spanned the states of Durango, Chihuahua, and Sinaloa in northwestern Mexico. And together by 1947, 10 towns in the region produced around 90% of the US market in illegal drugs. Now, this place would be home to Mexico's first opium industry and Mexico's leading opium supplier for the next 80 years. It still is to this day. Some of its inhabitants would use their skills to become Mexico's first narcos, first narcotraficantes, first traffickers, rotating among heroin, marijuana, and cocaine, depending on US tastes. It also, during this period, got a name. It became known as the Golden Triangle of Mexico. So what do we know about this early trade which emerged in the 1940s? Well, first off, most of the poppy growing was done by the Sierra's poor peasant farmers, just as it is today. They were called gomeros, or gummers, after the opium gum that they harvested. They planted the seeds, they extracted the sap, and they then sold the opium to the traffickers, who would either cook it down and then smuggle it over the border. Poppy growing then in the highlands was a family job. Men tilled the earth and sowed the seeds. Women and children took care of the fields, pulled out the weeds, and collected the gum. It was part of their everyday chores. The local newspaper, actually, which sent a reporter to the highlands in 1947, reported the opium trade was a bonanza for, and I quote, the working class, especially the women who've been employed to collect gum as they used to be employed to pick tomatoes. This newspaper then captured one of the key elements of the trade. There was no stigma and no threat of danger attached to it. It was like, in the 1940s, picking tomatoes. It was an everyday chore. What else about it? Well, second, above the peasants, the people who bought the opium and made it into heroin or morphine, were the intermediaries. Today, they would be termed drug traffickers, and their name dot the early reports. And I'm showing you a report here that I got from the Mexican archive of various drug traffickers. See some of the names: Fermin Fernandez, Fidel Carrillo, Ignacio Landel, Gil Caro, Rafael Fonseca. Now, there's a reason their names sound so familiar. Many were the fathers and uncles of the generation of drug traffickers that came to prominence 3 decades later. Gil Caro was the uncle of Rafael Caro Quintero, the chap on the right of this picture, international weed smuggler and an integral member of the Guadalajara cartel. Rafael Fonseca was the father of his mentor, Ernesto Don Neto Fonseca, who's on the left. Don Neto was the uncle to Amado Carrillo, the Lord of the Skies, famous cocaine smuggler. But there were other connections as well. Fermin Fernandez, who's the guy on the right here, was also uncle of this guy in the center, a guy called Eduardo Lalo Fernandez, who would become Mexico's first major heroin chemist during the 1940s and 1950s. So in effect, the 1940s drug trade in Mexico was like a Narcos prologue. Many of the grandparents and parents of those involved in the trade later on. Third, and perhaps most surprisingly from the perspective of today, the trade was a fairly peaceful industry. Teamwork was the rule. The people shared risks and they shared rewards. The industry didn't emerge from the world of organized crime, but rather it mapped over existing friendships, comradeship, commercial links. Most of these novice traffickers were friends first and traffickers a distant second. Their backgrounds were in farming or trade or the import-export business, and many had fought together as part of the Mexico's revolutionary armies. As a result, conflict and murder during this period were very rare. In fact, I make the argument elsewhere, the drug trade wasn't simply pacific, it actually brought down the homicide rate in the Golden Triangle, basically by spreading wealth. Finally, and most controversially, the relationship between the state and the drug traffickers emerged during this period. Basically, the relationship was that of a protection racket. Now, what do I mean by a protection racket? So at the time, both the US and the Mexican governments had firm laws against drug growing and drug trafficking. And in theory, they ran annual police and military campaigns against the drug traffickers. But in practice, these campaigns were a complete sham. From the 1940s onwards, the governors of the states of the Golden Triangle protected the traffickers from the anti-narcotics laws and their enforcement, and in return, charged them a percentage of the profits. These charges were, and still are, often roundly dismissed as bribes, as forms of corruption. And no doubt a lot of them went into the bank accounts of these unscrupulous governors. But in many ways, they were more like taxes. The state police collected them, would hand them over to the state tax collectors directly. And the money itself didn't simply go into bank accounts, but also paid for schools, infrastructure, and administrative jobs. Now, the two pictures you can see here are two governors of the state of Sinaloa who ran these protection rackets. The first one on the left is Macias Valenzuela, who really pioneered this kind of form of protection racket. The guy on the right in the center is a guy called Leopoldo Sanchez Solis, who was governor of Sinaloa during the 1960s. You might recognize the very tall man to his left. That is Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, who became, during the 1980s, Mexico's foremost cocaine trafficker, but in actual fact started his career as a bodyguard for Leopoldo Sanchez Solis. He effectively collected the taxes from the drug growers. So there's a clear link between the state governments, and the traffickers. The Mexican drug trade then started as rural, Pacific, small scale, geographically limited, and protected by local politicians. So what changed in the intervening years? How did it get so big? Well, most importantly, the scale of the drug trade changed. From the 1960s onwards, as the baby boomers came of age, rebelled, went to war, and then got rich, the US thirst for narcotics grew massively. At first, it was for weed. So in 1962, around 2 million Americans, or 1% of the population, had experimented with weed. By 1970, around 3 million Americans were trying the drug for the first time every year. And by 78, 60% of the country's high schoolers had tried the drug. After weed came heroin. Heroin, in the words of one historian, left the ghetto and crossed the suburban and military firewalls. Heroin became a drug for middle-class kids. And by 74, one study claims 6% of men between 20 and 30 had tried heroin, and half of them were hooked. Finally, by the late 70s, it was cocaine. And between 81 and 84, US cocaine imports doubled from 70 to 140 tons per year. So basically, there's a huge increase in the drug trade. Now, sources of these drugs ebbed and flowed over time, but Mexico was constant. And in the mid-1970s, it grew 90% of weed, produced 95% of US heroin, and by the end of the decade, it was shifting about 30 to 40% of Latin American cocaine. The other big change was in the protection rackets, right? Who got the money from the drug trade? By the mid-1970s, the drug trade then was producing earnings around a third of Mexican exports. It was massive and it was profitable. At the same time, the Mexican federal government was slipping from one economic disaster to another. It also faced an array of political enemies, in particular, guerrilla insurgencies. So and sorry, this is a map of the kind of changing areas of the drug trade in Mexico during the 60s and 70s. Anyway, someone at the top of the federal government took a decision. They would take over the local drug protection rackets. So federal cops from the Mexican version of the FBI, called the PJF, descended on drug producing and drug smuggling regions. They intimidated or killed the state cops that used to run the local protection rackets. They kidnapped the traffickers. They then tortured and extorted them for money. Then they let them go. Now, again, a lot of the money went into the cops' private accounts, no doubt. But the rest went towards funding Mexico's federal security forces. It went towards paying for the police, for the spies, and for the army that were taking out these guerrilla insurgents. And you can see some of the architects, if not the originators, of these protection rackets. The guy on the left is a guy called Oscar Flores Sanchez, who was head of the Attorney General's office. The guy with the, what you can see in the center is Arturo Durazo, who was head of Mexico City. and was in charge of basically charging cocaine importers money. The guy next to him is Raul Mendiolea, who was head of the PJF. And the chap on the right is a guy called, sorry about this, Zoria, who was head of the spy agency, the DFS, during the period. All of these guys were involved in shaking down and protecting drug traffickers. They also came up with a kind of language for this. So the plaza was the area that each PJF policeman charged drug traffickers in. The term they used for charging the drug traffickers was the derecho de piso, or the right to work in that plaza. Now, these are terms which are still used today, but interestingly, they don't come from organized crime. They come from within the Mexican state. They're police words. Mexico then, by the 1980s, not only had the world's most profitable drug economy, it had one which was regulated and protected by the state's security forces. So again, what changed? How do we go from a large but relatively controlled industry to the criminal free-for-all of today? So over the last 15 years, a lot of scholars and commentators have asked the same question, and academia has met true crime. Now, drawing on my research, as well as a lot of the rather complex political science analyses, the changes that have happened over the last 30 years were about two things, pretty obvious things: money and power. First off, during the 1990s, the Colombian traffickers were feeling the heat. US officials had managed to shut down the Florida trafficking route almost completely. And the US and Colombian agents were working together to dismantle Pablo Escobar's cocaine empire. So the Colombian traffickers came up with a solution. The Mexicans would now take the risk for transporting cocaine north of the border. A Cali cartel accountant who gave evidence in a Miami courtroom in 1997 explained how this new system worked. It was called the one-for-one system. Half the cocaine now went to the Mexicans, half remained with the Colombians. Now, what effect did this have? Well, basically, for every 2 kilos traffickers crossed over the border, they no longer got a $1,000 crossing fee each kilo. Now, they got the wholesale value of that kilo of cocaine on the American side. By the mid-1990s, this was $25,000. If they could cut it and distribute it through their own networks in the US cities, they could make around $200,000 profit for each kilo they passed. That's 2 zeros more profit, right? So during the 1980s then, experts estimated that the drug trade brought in between $2 billion and $6 billion a year. But by the 1990s, because of this change, it was bringing in at least 30 billion, right? That was, as they admitted, an estimate, a guesstimate, but it valued narcotics as worth 38% of Mexican exports and over 4 times the value of the biggest legal export, oil. So if the money from the Colombian cocaine business changed the nature of the drug smuggling, it also changed traffickers' relationship with the state. Now, this wasn't inevitable. Had the Mexican state been financially buoyant, coherent, and politically strong, perhaps it could have controlled this rush of cash. But in the midst of the counterculture, it had crushed independent marijuana and heroin smugglers and forced favored traffickers to pay them protection money. The policy was brutal, yet it had enforced a degree of control. But by the mid-1990s, the state was markedly weaker. The economy was tumbling. Real wages nearly halved during that decade. The ruling party, the PRI, that had run Mexico for 70 years, began to break up into factions, and rival political parties like the PAN and the PRD started to win for the first time big city and state elections. Now, the combinations of drug traffickers on the up and a political system on the down was a potent and unstable combination. And by the mid-1990s, the drug traffickers themselves started to take over the drug protection rackets from the federal cops and the federal spies. So it was drug traffickers then, by the 90s, who now decided who trafficked where, which plaza they used, how much these traffickers paid, and what to do with the traffickers that refused, mostly kill them. It was the drug traffickers that now controlled territory as what we know today as cartels. And it was these cartels that started to employ their own private armies to enforce these protection rackets. By the late 1990s, then, drug-related murders were on the up, around 300 to 500 a year, according to the most reliable estimates. Now, most of the victims were small-scale drug smugglers who'd refused to pay these new cartels their fees. The Mexican drug trade, in short, started to resemble the violent criminal enterprise of today. Okay, so what has made these murders go from around 500 a year to nearer 20,000? Well, over the past, and here you can see this is a map, actually a DEA map of the array of different drug traffickers during the 1980s. Okay, and this is what happened during the 1990s. As I said, increased cocaine profits, democratization, other parties gaining power, and the fragmentation of Mexican security forces. So the drug traffickers take over the protection rackets and basically become cartels, and they now charge the traffickers for protection. So what happens in the next 20 or so years to create such a violent trade? Well, there are many changes which have accelerated these processes. They include the diversification into synthetic drugs like meth and fentanyl, the return of a thriving heroin market in the United States, which have spread the industry throughout Mexico's 31 states. They include the massive trade in US guns, which means that now 70% of murders, rather than 30% of murders, are achieved by firearm in Mexico. And they include the completely unreported rise in Mexico's own drug market, which has gone from essentially zero in 2000 to a major problem in both urban centers and rural drug producing regions. But the change I want to end to today is not actually about drugs at all. And I think it tells us something about what's going on in Mexico today. What's essentially happened over the last 2 decades is that the criminal organizations, these cartels that formed in the 1990s, have gone from charging protection money just for drug trafficking to charging protection money for doing any illicit or licit business. So you steal cars in Mexico, you rob fuel, you burgle houses, you kidnap businessmen, you now have to pay the cartels a part of your profits. But it's more than that. You now have a small factory or a plot of avocado plants or a small shop or just a tortilla machine. You even teach at a local school. You now have to pay these organizations money in certain parts of the country. It's a strategy then that was first pioneered by a group of former Mexican military men turned traffickers called the Zetas, which you can see to the left. But it's now pretty much every cartel does the same, supplementing trafficking money for the traditional source of mafia cash, protection shakedowns. And the letter in the center is something that a businessman from the town of Torreon gave me, which was it was basically a printed note the Zetas sent to all the businessmen in Torreon in 2011. It had nothing to do with drugs. It simply says, we know you've got cash and we want a percentage of it. And if you didn't pay, you got killed. So this is now what's going on. It has very little to do with drugs in many places. And I wanted to end with a good example of why it's got nothing to do with drugs anymore. Now, the most murderous place in Mexico is not a drug producing region. It's not where they produce 60% of Mexico's heroin, which is the state of Guerrero. It's not where they produce most of Mexico's meth, which is Michoacan, or it's not the most popular smuggling corridor, which is Tamaulipas. It's, in actual fact, the most murderous state in Mexico is the previously quiet Catholic state of Guanajuato in the middle of the country. Now, this place has no history of drug growing. Don't grow drugs there. It's got no port to introduce precursor chemicals or cocaine. It's got no discernible chemicals industry. It has no entry point to the United States. It's not on the border. And it does lie on a road from drug producing regions up to the border. There are plenty of other states you can go through to move heroin and meth. Yet between 2013 and 2018, annual murders in Guanajuato increased by 400%, from 700 to 3,412. It was the most of any Mexican state. Now, why was this going on? Well, basically, half a dozen local gangs who basically term themselves cartels, but don't have that much to do with drug trafficking, are fighting for control of a variety of criminal enterprises. In the big industrial city of Leon, for example, conflicts center on selling weed and crystal meth to the local market. In mid-sized towns like Guanajuato and Celaya, they focus on kidnapping and extortion. And while around the big Salamanca oil refinery, groups struggle to monopolize the theft of petroleum. So the drug trade then, over the last 80 years, has turned from a drug war to now an all-out criminal free-for-all, which is what's going on in Mexico today. Thank you very much.
All right. Great. Thanks, Benjamin. I think it's true that although the United States shares a very long border with Mexico, we don't really know very much about Mexico or its history. So I think it's important for us to get educated on that. In your book, you mentioned that Mexico's president, López Obrador, says there might be 37 cartels in Mexico. I mean, is that accurate? And what about the accuracy of the term itself, cartel? Is that an American invention?
So yeah, cartel's gone through kind of, I suppose, two different phases. It was an American invention. It was first used to describe, actually, people think it's the Colombian cartels. It was first used to describe Mexican traffickers in the 1970s. And it was meant to show that they were attempting to kind of monopolize and control prices, rather like the OPEC oil cartel did in the 1970s. It then used to describe Pablo Escobar in the 80s, and then used to describe the cocaine cartel, the Guadalajara cartel, as well during the late 1980s. Now, during this period, I don't think it was terribly accurate. These people didn't really control prices, and there wasn't really a set hierarchy within these cartels. So this is the American use of cartel in the 1980s. However, during the 1990s, Mexican organized crime groups adopted this language of cartels. They started to say, we are cartels. And they started to, as I was saying, control territory and attempt to shake down all the traffickers and then all the other criminals within that territory. So I think the term cartel now is quite a useful term to describe criminal enterprises that work as almost de facto states controlling swathes of Mexico. So, I mean, I know that people still have the problem, some academics particularly have a problem with the term cartel today, but I think it's a fairly useful term that is used by the criminals themselves to describe what they're doing. So yes, it wasn't. So in a tediously complex academic answer, yes, it was invented by the Americans, but now it's quite a useful term to describe what is going on.
All right. Who do you believe are some of the top leaders of Mexico's drug smuggling organizations today? I mean, who are the top bosses? I mean, obviously, El Chapo Guzman is imprisoned in the United States.
Well, so still the state of Sinaloa, where Chapo Guzman comes from, and where the basically heroin making industry emerged in the 1940s, it's still a center of the drug trade, and still many of those families are involved in the kind of networks that traffic drugs. Quite who leads these, I think it's fairly difficult to say. They're to think of them as set hierarchies, I think slightly problematic. They're much more like kind of networks with different nodes, but an important person within that network is still clearly Ismael El Mayo Zambada, who is the kind of partner of Chapo Guzman, and who has many kind of family members who are still involved in the trade. However, as you rightly point out, we've seen the emergence of much kind of smaller cartels and smaller networks. Another important one is the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, which is really the kind of the counterpoint to the Sinaloans, the kind of second biggest cartel, which previously specialized in meth, but has now moved into basically shifting all forms of drug, including fentanyl and heroin, over the border. Beyond these kind of big organizations, I think what's shocked me, I suppose, over the last 5 or 6 years is how many really tiny operations there are that probably sell to these bigger traffickers at the border. So if you go down to Guerrero, there are about 12 separate small organizations that are buying opium and making heroin in the mountains. So there's a group called Los Ardios, which is effectively run by one family in eastern Guerrero, and this family also seems to have a senator in the local Senate. So these are kind of politically linked kind of groups. But yeah, there are loads of tiny, smaller ones that are still in existence. Another group, which is very of the moment, called Los Talibanes, which operates in Zacatecas. So yeah, there are these much smaller groups as well.
Well, right now, sort of topic A in world affairs is Afghanistan. And for many years, Afghanistan was seen as the top producer of opium poppies. How would you compare Afghanistan's production to Mexico's production, which is, would you say it's relatively recent, the big increase in production of opium in Mexico?
So it's kind of interesting to see how this ebbs and flows. So Mexico, what I always kind of describe it as the America's emergency opium supplier. So basically, Mexican opiates in general are not terribly high quality. They're not strong, effectively, and they often are what they call black tar opiates, which are made in kind of almost kind of field chemical labs rather than in much more kind of professional pharmacies. So what happened? Mexico, if any other source of opiates is cut off from the United States, Mexico is always there to fill in the gap. So during the 1970s, it produced 95% of America's heroin. During the 1980s and 1990s, it didn't produce much heroin, partly because the US didn't have a massive heroin addiction problem. During the 2000s, however, Mexico has again stepped into the breach and now produces the vast majority of Americans' heroin. Afghanistan, you're absolutely right, is a huge heroin producer, but it actually produces mostly for the European and the Asian market, particularly Iran. So it's not a huge supplier to the United States. That's been Mexico for the last 2 decades or so.
In your book, you describe how you went to a relatively small village in the early 2000s, and it was a very simple place, not much economic activity. And then you came back to the same village 15 years later, and you were shocked to see how much incredible economic activity there was. And you asked around, and people didn't really want to tell you why, but they said it was because of the poppies. It was the poppy farming.
Yeah, so absolutely. So my family, or my wife's family, comes from a state in the southern United States called Oaxaca, and I spent most of my early career basically studying religion there and studying the Catholic Church and studying kind of indigenous rites around the Catholic Church. So I used to kind of wander around the hills and the shrines, and it's really kind of beautiful place, very kind of friendly and open. And that's what I did from the kind of early 2000s. But it struck me when I returned there in 2015 that these places had gone from really kind of tiny, fairly underdeveloped places to there were these kind of bursts of economic activity. And when you there were 2 things you noticed. One, you weren't allowed onto the hills to see the shrines because you were told, don't go up there, people have guns, because they were growing opium and protecting the fields. And secondly, you saw this kind of array of shops that were being built. Everyone had a kind of second story on top of their home that was being built. Everyone had a new car. So this was a kind of economic boom, it was basically kind of a bit like remittances, but without the heartache, because at least your men didn't have to go up to the US to work. They could work in Mexico. So it was a kind of peasant lifeline during the early 2000s, at least until the invention of, or until the popularity of fentanyl, which has basically slightly hit this this peasant economy.
Well, kind of on the same subject, you write that about 800, or about 1/3 of Mexico's municipalities today grow opium poppies, and Mexico provides 90% of the US heroin market. Is there anything that can be done for these peasant farmers to end their reliance on drug producing poppies? I mean, maybe some other kind of crop that could kind of reduce this problem?
So there are really two ideas that are floating around the Mexican government at the moment. The first one is crop substitution. Now, this has been tried throughout the globe, particularly in Colombia and other areas of Asia. Broadly, sadly, it's failed because, frankly, the profits you can get from narcotics are just so much higher than you can get from any other crop. So even a fairly high price crop like avocados, which you can make a fair amount of money out of, doesn't compare with what you can get from opium poppy production. Also, some of these crops like avocados use up a load of water. So they're not actually sustainable in a lot of these places. So there are problems with crop substitution, which really haven't been solved in other countries where it's been introduced. The other solution the Mexican government has been thinking about is basically starting its own legal morphine industry. So basically Mexico, ironically, for a massive producer of opiates, actually imports its painkillers from Europe and from the US. So some people in the Mexican government have been talking about actually creating their own morphine factories using opium poppy gum and then transforming it into morphine, which would then be used on Mexican patients. To what extent this would have a major effect, because basically the US market in illegal heroin is much greater than the legal market in Mexican morphine. So quite what effect this would have, but it would certainly make some of them at least get involved in a legal trade rather than an illegal trade. So I think those are the two options the Mexican government have on the table.
You address in your book the so-called Kingpin Strategy. That's the policy by American and Mexican authorities as a law enforcement approach. And could you describe that and then tell us why you view that as a failure?
So I mean, the Kingpin strategy was started off in Colombia, where to a certain extent it seemed to work. It certainly seemed to kind of reduce to a certain extent the violence connected to the drug trade by taking down members of the Cali and the Medellin cartels like Pablo Escobar. It was pushed very much in Mexico in kind of the early mid 2000s, then and again particularly under President Peña Nieto in the mid 2010s. So Mexico, I think it arrested or killed 120 out of 135 leading drug traffickers. The problem is it did absolutely nothing to drug supply. So the idea behind this is if you take down the kingpin, you basically destroy the networks. Well, this clearly didn't happen. In actual fact, the price and the amount of drugs, the price of drugs in the US goes down during the 2010s while they're taking out all these kingpins. The amount of drugs going from Mexico into the United States goes up. At the same time, there also is quite a lot of fallout from this kingpin strategy. So effectively, the traditional argument is that lots of different criminals start to fight about who's going to be the kingpin after, let's say, Chapo has been arrested. I'm not 100% convinced by this argument. I think much more probable is that in order to take down a kingpin, you need to you effectively need informants within the cartel. So what this does is create kind of paranoia among drug traffickers, and they all start to kind of kill each other, believing each other is an informant who is kind of working on behalf of the government. So, I mean, this happened, for example, in 2009. The Mexicans arrested a guy called Arturo Beltran Leyva, probably on the information of Chapo Guzman. So that caused a massive division within the Sinaloa cartel. And Beltran Leyva's brothers blamed Chapo Guzman for the arrest of their brother. So it causes these kind of divisions within the cartels and a lot of the bloodshed that follows.
You write also that there's a lot of myth making about American and Mexicans, specifically the drug trade and law enforcement. What do you think, for instance, about the popular Netflix series Narcos Mexico? Was that another example of myth making, or an almost true picture of what occurred?
It's enormously controversial. I don't want to necessarily get myself into trouble with this. I don't know if you've been following the kind of fallout, but effectively there is a division within the DEA over that series. So on the one hand, you have Jaime Kuykendall, who was the DEA agent who basically gave the story for Narcos Mexico, which blames the killing of Kiki Camarena on a kind of combination of drug traffickers and the Mexican government. There's also another DEA agent called Hector Perez, who did a documentary called The Last Narc, which is on Amazon Prime, which disputes this idea and claims that, in actual fact, it was the CIA that was behind the killing. Now, in all frankness, as I say, this has now got so controversial that I don't know if you've seen this, but Jaime Kuykendall is the DEA guy is suing Hector Perez for defamation. So this has got very, very messy. My personal academic opinion is there are holes in both arguments. I think it is possible the CIA knew about what was going on in Mexico. It might have even covertly supported it. I'm not terribly convinced by the idea that it was the CIA that actually killed Kiki Camarena. So I think, in many ways, the Narcos Mexico series does include some quite useful kind of historical information. I don't think it's a complete mythology, or not as bad as a lot of them, certainly.
How has the recent legalization of marijuana in many American states affected Mexican drug smuggling of marijuana specifically?
It's basically destroyed it. So the vast majority of Mexico, which is Mexican marijuana, which is not terribly good quality, now goes to Mexicans, right? So what it has done is it's created a boom in Mexican marijuana taking, particularly in the northern. And it's mean that a lot of peasants, rather than growing marijuana, turned to growing opium poppies and funding the kind of heroin business. So it did have a kind of major effect, but not a terribly beneficial effect, sadly.
You mentioned the American Mafia's supposed involvement in Mexican heroin smuggling from the 40s on was relatively marginal. American pop history claims that Charles Lucky Luciano and Ben Siegel took part in the smuggling back then. Is that overblown, or is that sort of a myth as well?
I have no doubt that the American Mafia during the 1940s did try and get heroin from Mexico and sent people down there. The most famous of which was this rather mysterious character called Max Kosman, aka Max Weber. I actually managed to, kind of extraordinarily, I managed to track down members of his family and talk to them about his kind of early life and how he ended up. He went from New York to, I think, Pennsylvania to Los Angeles, and then down to Mexico. Eventually married a Mexican woman, and he was clearly involved in buying up heroin on behalf of Bugsy Siegel. But there is an idea that they kind of created the heroin industry, or they helped develop it, or they gave the tech which allowed Mexicans to produce heroin from opium poppies. That I don't believe. I don't think they were that integral to it. But they certainly were buying it in the 1940s. However, I suppose the other thing to bear in mind is that also it fizzled out. By the early 1950s, the mafia simply got out of Mexico and were much more interested, through Lucky Luciano, in buying heroin from Europe. So it was a brief kind of foray into the Mexican market, which has always been really a kind of, it's been a Mexican thing.
Interesting. What do you think is the best solution to this huge and seemingly intractable problem of drug smuggling from Mexico and drug abuse in America? Is the legalization of drugs such as heroin and other opiates a possible solution, or is this just going to be an ongoing problem indefinitely?
Well, I think if one thing, depressingly, if one thing that this history has shown me is this is, we've tried effectively every prohibitionist technique for the last 100 years, and 100,000 people died of drug overdoses last year in the United States. So it's just gone up, right? I remember, it's incredibly depressing to read kind of 1970s reports from the US State Department saying, oh my God, heroin use has got out of control. 1,700 people died of drug overdoses this year. 100,000 died last year. And we've been fighting an increasingly brutal war against the drug cartels for the last 40 years. It simply hasn't worked. Would legalization work? I don't think it's necessarily a silver bullet. I think what would, along with legalization, you clearly need very, very good medical care and treatment of people who are addicts. I think that's also perhaps more important than legalization itself. So trying to kind of wean people of it or control their habit. But legalization would certainly, it would stop the kind of illegal end of this in Mexico, which would be helpful.
What about Mexico itself? Are there states in Mexico that allow people to purchase and use marijuana and other drugs, or do they still have the prohibition that sort of similar to America's?
So they have slowly they have gradually decriminalized marijuana within Mexico. So a law went through recently, although it's still kind of at the Supreme Court level. So it's very gradually being that is going to change. In terms of other drugs, their laws are as harsh as the United States, if not harsher. So there are a lot of people now over the last decade or so in jail for having small quantities of cocaine or heroin on them, probably for personal use. So this is something that, it's a problem which really the US government hasn't really focused on, partly because it's not really their problem, but also it's slightly embarrassing because the reason Mexico has a massive drug problem now is because it's been producing US drugs for the last, or large amounts of it for the last 20 years. And the Mexicans as well kind of want to ignore it because they want to blame it on the US. But Mexico now has a very large drug problem in many big cities and even in rural areas.
All right, well, let's open it up to audience questions. I've got a question here from Monica Boglin. With origins of cultivation in Mexico, I wonder if that country has the addiction and incarceration rates that are all too common here in the States.
That's a good question. As I say, it didn't. What I felt was quite interesting when I did this research is for 80 years, Mexico provided the vast majority of America's drugs and had no problem with addiction at all. So when in the 1970s, about 650,000 Americans were addicted to heroin, and they tried to do a survey of Mexican addiction rates, and they couldn't find a heroin addict in Mexico. I think they interviewed 20,000 people, and they couldn't find somebody addicted to heroin. 60% of Mexican high schoolers American high schoolers in the US had taken marijuana in the 1970s. About 1% of Mexicans had taken marijuana, right? So there wasn't a problem. Over the last 20 years, as the government has lost control of this trade and the cartels have taken over, these cartels have started to sell drugs on Mexican streets. So what's happening, for example, if you go over the Mexican border to Ciudad Juarez or Tijuana, it's not really a fight over trafficking drugs anymore. It's not a fight over who controls the tunnels. It's more a fight over who sells on what corner. It's basically what happened in New York in the 1980s or Baltimore in the 1990s. It's a fight of petty drug vendors for control of small places for vending drugs. So sadly, that has happened in Mexico, and there has been a uptick in incarceration for drug addicts as a result.
You mentioned in recent years, drug traffickers are also becoming involved in other, polycrime, other crimes, kidnapping, robbery, extortion, human trafficking. Is that because they're making less money on drug trafficking, or is it because they can just do it and they can make extra money with these other rackets inside Mexico?
Basically, yeah, because they can get away with it, because levels of impunity in Mexico are extraordinary. So less than 1% of murders are ever charged. So they've effectively extended what they were doing, which was basically shaking down drug traffickers, to shaking down anyone who has a kind of illicit or licit business. So yeah, they have moved into this, into these other forms of crimes, which are, way more socially destructive. So one thing that I do is I do a lot of expert witness work for Mexican migrants who are running away from violence in Mexico, running away from cartels who have, put out hits on them or have beaten them up or have, murdered members of their family. And you find out the vast majority are not running because they're a kind of high up member of the Sinaloa cartel. They're running because their tortilla stand was being extorted by some cartel, or their avocado plantation. So this is the reality of what's happening in some areas. I have to say, I have to be quite clear about this. Not all areas of Mexico. Some areas of Mexico.
I was reading a UN report, and it claimed that much of the world market for cocaine has shifted to Europe in recent years. I think you touched on that a bit. So how does the cocaine market in Europe compare to the American market? Has the American market gone down as Europe has gone up, or is it still really high, or what?
No. So this is something that I didn't really realize either. My assumption was that America was still the massive importer and taker of cocaine. So during the 1990s, America took 70% of the world's cocaine, an extraordinary amount. However, over the last 2 decades, well, it's really since 2008, the presumed US imports of cocaine have decreased. Less Americans take it, and they've moved. Cocaine, in a way, is a good time drug. It's not a drug that is taken in periods of economic problems, which we had post 2008 and now post the pandemic. So Americans have moved to instead, sadly, taking opiates, and there've been kind of 3 opiate epidemics almost concurrently. You've had the addiction to OxyContin, you've then had the addiction to heroin, and now you've got an addiction to fentanyl. So these are what Americans are taking. The production of cocaine has not fallen globally. Colombia, Peru, Bolivia still produce exactly the same amount of tons as they did in the early 2000s, but now they're selling it in 2 places in much greater bulk than they did before. The first is Europe, not only Western Europe, but also Eastern Europe. So kind of Russia and the old Eastern Bloc. But also now Latin America, right? Latin America didn't have a coke addiction problem. Brazil now, many people think Brazil imports more cocaine than the United States. So there's been this kind of, fairly rapid and I don't think terribly well analyzed change in the geography of the cocaine trade over the last decade or so.
Well, we got another question from Carolyn and Gary. Can you comment on the parallels between the rise of cartels and US mob history?
So it's something, I mean, to write this book, I read a lot of stuff on organized crime, a lot of stuff on the mafia in general. And one thing that I think that people, we obsess to a certain extent over drug trafficking, and think that this is the kind of the unique evil of what's going on, the unique kind of cause of what's going on in Mexico. But in actual fact, the criminal organizations in Mexico are actually much closer to mafia organizations than we might think, right? Yes, they are somewhat concerned with trafficking drugs, but they operate actually, much more like the mafia. So they go to local businesses, illegal and illegal, and shake them down for money. So pretty much what the US mob did in the early 20th century, up really to the 1950s, 1960s, what the Sicilian Mafia was doing from the 1870s, 1880s onwards, right? That is what is these cartels are. They're much closer to mafia operations than we give them credit for.
Has the Sicilian Mafia tried to infiltrate the Mexican cartels, or are they pretty much not involved much in it?
So during the early 1970s, there were clearly links between the Sicilian Mafia so this is basically the Sicilian Mafia took heroin from Marseille heroin factories made by Corsicans and took it to the US. Now, during the late 60s, early 70s, around a third of that, they trafficked it through Mexico. But they basically, most of them got arrested and or murdered by Mexican traffickers and Mexican policemen during the early 1970s. So they did certainly have a crack at it, rather like the US Mafia during the 1940s. But again, they were relatively unsuccessful at setting up a kind of stable arrangement. As I say, I do one chapter on that, on the kind of links with that the Sicilian Mafia and Mexico, but it was a fairly brief attempt to set up a link.
All right. Well, Benjamin, thank you so much for joining us. Again, Benjamin's book is The Dope, The Real History of the Mexican Drug Trade. And thank you so much for joining us all the way from, is it Coventry?
Warwick. Yeah.
Warwick.
Yeah.
Warwick.
Yeah.
Well, great. And thank you all for joining us too. And hope to see you sometime. Come and visit us if you can.
I'd be delighted. Thank you so much.
Okay. Yes. Thank you, Benjamin.
Cheers.
Cheers.